Next generation education in the time of COVID-19. This is part 2 of a 4-part series that we've been conducting at the Friday Institute for Educational Innovation here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our focus today is on educational equity. I'm Hiller Spires, Executive Director at the Friday Institute, Associate Dean in the College of Education here at North Carolina State University. Today, we're posing the question, how can we engage this crisis that we're all in to think futuristically about how to meet the needs of all learners? In part 1 of this series, we heard from North Carolina leaders about key issues that are surfacing amidst the current crisis and what we could learn from these issues to help transform our educational system. In our second session today, we're going to do a deep dive on educational equity and how the current situation provides a hyper focus on the inequities within our system and what actions we are currently taking, as well as what future actions we can take to address these issues. We know that prior to COVID, we've had a persistent achievement gap and educational attainment gap. We know that the effects of the current crisis are experienced more intensively by the most vulnerable in our society. For example, students living in poverty, those with disabilities, immigrants, people of color, and those who are living in challenging family situations. But we're also witnessing educators as they create heroic responses to this crisis. They're mobilizing to teach their students online, preparing and distributing learning packets, providing meals for their students, and as we all know, much, much more that we don't even know about. Teachers, school administrators, other personnel, and educational leaders are trying to support children and families. I'm going to now introduce our distinguished panel. We, again, thank you for joining us today. We know that you are all very busy, so thank you for taking time out to engage in this important discussion. Let's see, we'll start with John Hensley. He's the first one on my screen. John is a teacher and social studies chair at Southeast Raleigh Magnet High School. Next, we have Dr. Valerie Bridges. She's the superintendent. Thank you for waving, Valerie. She's superintendent at Edgecombe County Public Schools. Next, Dr. Lynn Moody, who is also a superintendent, and she's with us from Rowan-Salisbury School System. Then we have James Ford, who is a North Carolina State Board of Education member. He's also the executive director of the Center for Racial Equity in Education. And then finally, we have Mallory Mabalia. Mallory is the director of educational engagement at UNC TV. Thank you again for all of you for being here. Now, I've asked the panelists to address 2 questions for us today. So they will give each one of them will give opening remarks. And then the audience will have a chance to ask questions. So feel free to send your questions to the chat line when we get ready for audience participation. The 2 questions that I've asked the speakers to prepare for: 1, how are you and your organization addressing educational inequities during this crisis? And if you can, give very specific examples for the audience. Also, number 2, what lessons and actions about educational equity can we carry forward post-COVID-19? We're going to get started with our 2 superintendents, Dr. Valerie Bridges and Dr. Lynn Moody. Both of you have the daunting charge of leading your district through this challenging time. Valerie, we're going to start with you and let us know what's going on at Edgecombe County and how you're dealing with the crisis there.
Sure. Thank you. Just want to say good morning again, and thank you, Dr. Flowers, for inviting me to join the Friday Institute panel. I especially appreciate you lifting up the topic of equity, most especially during these times. So we know that on Saturday, March 14th, that our lives in North Carolina and in the education changed drastically. This is something we've never seen before, we've never had to deal with. I am the proud superintendent of Edgecombe County Public Schools. We have 14 schools. We have about 6,000 students. We have one alternative program. And so the inequities, I'll start with this. The inequities existed before school closure was enacted. This pandemic with school closure has amplified the gap for students and families. What we want to assure for us is that we are vigilant in filling those gaps, working to eliminate and provide opportunities for all of our students as they matriculate through our school system. So first, I just want to acknowledge that off and online learning, absent a teacher in the classroom, having that engagement, noticing nuances of students, not having daily interactions and building relationships, that it cannot replace the face-to-face teacher. And so I just want to make sure that we capture that and that we understand that what we are doing now is what we have to do, what is best, what we can best do, but it does not replace what I've been able to do. And so in Edgecombe, I also want to mention that we are a CEP district, which means all of our students, we have community feeding. All of our students receive breakfast and lunch during a traditional school year at no cost. Before that, we were about 80% free and reduced lunch, which means out of 10 kids, 8 of those kids were receiving assistance and 2 were not. So that's, those statistics ring high. Those are high need. That's a high need district. So we have lots of challenges that other districts may not have, but these are things that we have to deal with. So some of the things that we have done as a district to support our students, to make sure we're doing the right things, to fill in the gaps, to keep things moving in the right direction, have been just our teachers, our administrators, our student support services, which would be our counselors, our nurses, our social workers, our EC staff, our EL staff, our migrant. They have, and our principals, our administrators as well, they have made a gallant effort to reach out to students, every student, to make sure that they have a connection. And each, we're gathering that information. If we have students who we're having a hard time reaching, sometimes you have to knock on the door. You knock on the door with a mask, with gloves on, but you have to make contact with that student. We cannot afford for any of our students to be off the grid and for us not to be able to contact them. Now, again, high need district, so there are lots of things going on. All of our students are not going to be able to remain at home while this is going on. Sometimes they're having to go to relatives' house that might live outside of Edgecombe. But again, we need to be able to contact you, hear from you, know that you're okay, and that you're proceeding with the assignments. In addition to that, we have offline and online learning. So the online, you understand that the modules, the things that teachers have put together, and you can reach those through Google Classroom and different platforms. Offline learning are learning packets, and those are for students who don't have access to internet. Now we have passed out a plethora of devices for our students, but in Edgecombe, and I don't know if you all had an opportunity to read the Ed&C article, it talked about the lack of infrastructure. So you could have a device, your parent could afford Wi-Fi, but there are certain parts of our county in which you cannot access Wi-Fi, or it is extremely expensive. And so that's a huge barrier. The infrastructure, you cannot have internet. And so that's a barrier for us. We were aware of that before this crisis. We had talked about it before this crisis, and because now we needed to have access for daily interactions with students, now it's huge. Now it's that gaping hole that kind of spreads as it becomes urgent that we do that. So we have the packets for students that have been created by teachers. I reviewed those packets. The work is very good quality, but again, it's pencil paper, worksheets, that's what it is. It is not the online. In addition to making sure that our students have offline and online learning opportunities, we've also just been really careful and focused on meal delivery and continuing to provide meals for our students. We have to balance that with our staff and our student safety, and making sure that our folks who are delivering meals have on masks, have on gloves, practice social distancing. But we wanted our students, again, 80% of our kids free and reduced lunch. That means that you need those meals. And so we've gone from 5 days of delivery for breakfast and for lunch to we do it twice a week. But when we do it twice a week, we have shelf-stable items so that they won't go bad. And we do it twice a week. Tuesdays, Thursdays, they get a hot lunch on Tuesday and Thursday, and then they have things packaged so that they can take them home. We also have a pickup site at our schools, 8 of our schools. We have a pickup site, so if a parent needs to come by, pick things up, you can. We don't ask names, we don't ask, we're just keeping count of how many. So it is not just any student who is in our community could come by and get a meal or get the meals that are needed. So those are 2 pieces. Again, balancing the safety of our staff along with making sure that we support our students. Our child nutrition director is looking into how she can support families for the weekend, because we recognize that there are folks who have lost wages, and so it may be difficult. We don't want our kids experiencing food insecurity, so how can we make sure on the weekend they have something in place? In addition to that, with we've advocated for broadband. We've sent emails out to our representatives. They have acknowledged that it's not an easy fix, it's not a quick fix, and when in a pandemic, in an emergency situation, you need a quick fix. We don't have that in place yet. So that's something that we're still kind of working through. We've also done some empathy conversations with parents. So I've done some parent advocacy meetings online to just stay connected to our parents, to hear some of the things that are concerning them. We have a hotline for parents, and we have someone who mans that hotline and responds back to parents almost immediately. We have a technology hotline so that if a parent is having a difficulty with an assignment online or reaching out to someone, that they have support and help there. So those are some of the things that we're doing. We've also done PD for teachers in a number of ways, because teachers needed to have support with how do I man this online? How do I make sure I keep connected to my kids? And actually today we had a full day from 9 to 2 of professional development for our teachers, kind of uplifting them and keeping them in our thoughts and in our prayers. Last thing I'll share is our social emotional. So in our packet, in our online, we are acknowledging that there are still mental health concerns. There are mental wellness concerns that can't be ignored. And so we do, again, that checking in with students, hearing from students, kind of monitoring things that are going on in the community and being a part of that, and then involving our faith-based community to help us with that and help us keep up with what's going on with our kids. So I'll stop there and see if there's anything else that you want me to share.
Yeah, thank you, Valerie. It sounds like you've got a comprehensive approach to trying to address the needs of your students. So thank you so much for such a incredible response to the crisis now. So we'll move on to Lynn, and Lynn, you can share some of your thoughts in terms of what you guys are doing in Rowan Salisbury, and maybe focus a little bit on what, if any, things that you're learning that you think will be able to carry over to post-COVID-19 that we really could have some maybe permanent changes.
Right. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me and including us. I won't repeat some of the things that Dr. Bridges said, but admire her work and what they are doing in Edgecombe, and we're doing some similar things to that. About 5 or 6 years ago, we became a one-to-one district, and our focus and our why for that was at that point in time around equity. We didn't really call it equity, but we knew that our students needed access and our parents need access to information. The difference often with students of poverty is the learning that doesn't take place outside of the schoolhouse for a variety of reasons, and they don't have access to information about learning outside of school. So we really wanted to close that gap and to be sure that our families had access to relevant on-time information. That became very important to us. So we started our work then around the areas of a technology device that we thought that students could use at home without internet, that would have some value in that. We looked for software that also allowed our students to participate in online learning and download and then upload when they came back to school. That was really critical, important when we picked our software partners. We did our professional development around those areas. And then we try to connect a strong infrastructure. So currently right now in our 34 schools, we have our parking lots open every day from morning to night for families in the community to be able to tap on to our internet. So that's partly helpful. And then we participated in a large hotspot with the $1 Million Sprint project last year and tried to close those gaps this year. We still have great gaps and places where we're worried. We have about 20,000 students. Out of those, close to 1,100 of those students we've had very little to almost no contact with, and that's very concerning to us. So we're really happy about the other almost 18,000 students that we are connecting with on a regular basis, but here's the things we're learning. And I think it's a good time to be positive about the future. We've been able to provide professional, much like Dr. Bridges said this afternoon, every Wednesday afternoons at 2, we bring in national keynote speakers for all 3,000 of our employees. And this afternoon we have George Curious, who wrote Innovate Inside the Box. So we're continuing to think about how to keep innovation in our DNA as we move forward. We learned you can't do daily lessons when people are in a crisis. You have to think holistic about a bigger picture of learning, which is wonderful because that part we're really celebrating. Often students and equity issues exist because we are constantly talking about students' gaps and deficits. And if we spent more time talking about students' strengths and the things that they bring to the table and enhancing those, I think that we would would serve our students better. So hopefully this will be a time, one of the things that we're learning is how do we look at individual students and what is it that they are really interested and passionate about, and now's a great time to tap into giving them time to explore that. We've learned to connect better with our parents, I believe. We're translating more. We're using our SRO officers to help us deliver book bags and printed material to students where we're having trouble reaching them, and a number of things. As Dr. Bridges said, we continue to know that we first have to be sure that they have food, and on an equity basis, we chose to continue to deliver those to our communities because Rowan County is a very large county, and often our students of poverty can't come to pick up food. So we've been lucky and fortunate that we've been able to continue to deliver meals. So those are some big lessons and we're trying to take advantage of the silver linings during this period of time, but really starting to plan and think about what we are learning and how we can use that for next year. I'll end with one thing. Had a great dialogue with a student who had sent me an email early on to say I didn't like school when we were in school. Now I really hate it because what you're teaching is not very relevant. He gave me some of the things that we were passing out to him that he was supposed to do online, and then had some questions about grading. So this afternoon at 4 o'clock, I have a group of students that I'm going to spend some time with to hear from their perspective about what's really not working and what do they want different for when we do come back. So thank you for letting us join.
Thank you. And that sounds like a great idea to get the ideas from the students. How appropriate is that? And I really like your emphasis on building on strengths. And I think that has a really critical connection to our discussion in educational equity as well. We're going to move now to John Hensley, who is a teacher. He's also the department head for the social studies department and at Southeast Raleigh. So we're very interested, John, in getting a perspective, a teacher perspective.
So I can talk a lot about the tactical view of all this. So I teach at a school, Southeast Raleigh, that's just south of downtown Raleigh. So our Wi-Fi infrastructure is pretty good in that area. What we found out early on was that we didn't have so much a connectivity problem with the students, but we had a issue where you'd have multiple students in a family and just access to one device or maybe no device. So early on, I think as early as Friday the 13th of March, we got in contact with all of our parents using the homeroom teachers and had them fill out a technology survey, wanting to know if they felt like there was a bottleneck involving access to a device at their house. And the data that I was shown, about 1/4 of our students had issues with devices. They didn't have enough devices to go around. So it might be just one computer with, 3 school-age students plus the mother and father trying to use that one computer at home. Or it might be a situation in which there were no devices at home except for cell phones, which made it, you really can't do the kind of work online that you need to do if you're just using a smartphone to pull that off. You really need that Chromebook. So within the first week, we were able to get Chromebooks into the hands of almost all the families that needed them, but still, we just had, we had to limit it to 1 Chromebook per family. So I think as I look at what we're up against here and what we can learn from it, is that it's not just enough to ask the students, do you have access to a computer at home? Do you have your own computer or your own device or your own Chromebook might be a better question to ask. Because whenever you've got a family that has, and many of our families have 3, 4, 5 school-age children, they've all got online classes now. It makes, just like if you've got a family that's trying to share one bathroom, the heartbreak that comes with that. I think you get an even worse situation if you're trying to teach everything online and a family just has one computer to fall back on. I mean, kids need their own dedicated device, and we're a long ways from getting to that as far as I can see. Another issue that I think has been highlighted in the last couple of weeks is that I think most of our teachers at Southeast had experience with putting things online. We were using Google Classroom, we were using Canvas, but it's hard to get a grasp on pacing when you're making online assignments. As I talk to students, many of them feel overwhelmed with all the material that dropped in just one day. 8 classes of work showed up on one day, and they got a little discouraged. So we've kind of fallen on the device of creating an online schedule. We were an A-day, B-day school, so on Mondays and Wednesdays, we still do that's when A-day stuff drops. Tuesdays and Thursdays, B-day assignments drop, and then Friday is reserved for virtual office hours or catch up, whatever the student wants to do. So we've kind of created a schedule and a template that the students can follow as they navigate the online at home. But I think it kind of closed things up for me, obviously, that reiterate that it's not enough to ask, do you have access to a device at home? You really need one-to-one for all the students in that house. They need their own dedicated device, and we are miles away from getting to that point. And again, while we have good infrastructure for Wi-Fi in Raleigh, we still had probably 5 to 10% of our families that don't have reliable Wi-Fi. So there's still a lot of room for improvement in there. And then the final thing I would stress would be that we've got to, work together in PLTs or in departments or as a school overall to make sure that we're not overwhelming the students with work, and that all the work is impactful and not just busy work, that it's stuff that's going to, directly connect to a standard and give the students something they want and need. I guess the very, I think that from a tactical standpoint, grading a clear grading policy becomes more important. We're still waiting for guidelines from Wake County as to how they want to handle grading for grades 9, 10, and 11. But I'll tell you that for me personally, I've been assigning grades in Google Classroom, and that seems to I think you forget how much of a motivator that kind of ranked feedback is for a student. And again, I would just stress that the next time we go through something like this, that we go into it with a grading policy figured out and communicated upfront.
Thank you, John. We just had a note from Lynn, and she said that in Rowan Salisbury, they also have families who have lots of devices, but the home internet doesn't support everyone at one time. So that's also another issue. We're going to move now to Mallory. And Mallory, you have been working on the at-home learning project at UNC-TV. And if I'm understanding it correctly, I believe you started that project as a result of this crisis. So tell us a little bit about that. And also, I know that you've said that you see it as a direct link to educational equity.
Oh, absolutely. So I want to say that I appreciate hearing all the perspectives I've heard from the people on this amazing panel. Thank you to the superintendents. Thank you to John as a teacher in Wake County. I mean, coming to you today, absolutely as the Director of Educational Engagement at UNC-TV, but my backstory is I was a kindergarten teacher, I was an assistant principal, and I'm a mama of 3, about to be a mama of 4. So I've got the whole perspective. Yes, I'm very pregnant right now, but you can't see it. That's why I kind of like this digital thing. I look kind of slim up here. To talk about what we've been doing at UNC-TV is this at-home learning initiative has been a response to what's going on right now, as a lot of things have been. A lot of things have been reactive to what's going on during this pandemic, which is natural. As humans, we're going to want to jump in, we're going to want to do things to help immediately. And going back to what Dr. Bridges said in the beginning, there is no replacement for a teacher. There is no replacement for being in the classroom. There's no replacement for a relationship. But what we can do in the public media space is pretty unique. So the divide, and the digital divide is what I'm going to talk about, which we've been all kind of talking about right now, has been present in education since technology advances originated. I mean, that hasn't just come out of the air. And that divide, like everybody has said, has only been highlighted during this time. I mean, there's already been classroom disparities. And, as a teacher, I was called to equitably serve my class. As an administrator, to equitably serve my school. But here in UNC-TV, I'm called to equitably serve our whole entire state. And that's not something I take lightly. So we have to stay abreast of everything that is constantly evolving in all 100 counties. So what we do know is that all of our channels are available for free over the air. And if you simply have a TV or an antenna, it is free to you. And we are available all over the state. So this learning initiative is high, and it is rooted in the knowledge that all families do not have access to broadband, but that we do know that we have this access over our public media programming. Our main station, just to give you an idea, reaches over 13 million households, and our Rudel 24/7 channel reaches over 3.8 million households in the state of North Carolina. And so the at-home learning programming that is now being offered on our NC channel is curriculum informed embedded, and it serves grades 4 through 8 from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. and grades 9 through 12 from 1 p.m. to 6 p.m. Although those times can vary, Everything from social studies, science, math, and literacy and the arts are all present. And as always, our younger audiences continue to be served through our programming on the Rudel 24/7 channel, as well as our main channel from 7 a.m. to 1 p.m. And that programming, of course, again, is vetted and educationally linked to standards and what teachers and families need our children to do to be prepared to go to school, especially in the early space. You know, we talk about everybody, all our babies don't go to preschool, but they do have access to this programming. And again, it's no replacement for a person, but we're trying to do a lot of parent empowerment and parent as teachers, especially with a lot of our outreach work and our PD. It's very educator, wow, that's a good new word, educator and parent partnership oriented for that exact purpose. In addition to the programming itself, of course, we have our sites of pbs.org/parents, PBS Learning Media, which is a plethora of a free database of standard aligned, everything from videos to lesson plans to everything that you can search by standard, you can search by grade level, you can search by grade area, as well as pbskids.org that have always been there and they'll continue to be there. Also through our partnership with DPI, as we've talked about packets in different districts. They are distributing packets, printed packets for the material, because again, we know every parent has a different circumstance. Every family has a different circumstance. We cannot blanket coat how we're going to reach everybody. But what we also know is that 96% of our population has cell phones. And so because we know this, we also provide a service that's called Bright by Text. And this Bright by Text service is for our families with children prenatal to age 8, giving parents parenting tips, social developmental tips, links to things that are happening in their communities, because we always carry our phone. Our phone is right there. And we're getting ready to actually present some free virtual professional development for educators, caregivers, and parents and guardians. And these professional development opportunities will be free, of course. And we're inviting them all to be on the same professional development together so that there is common language in the home about how to watch and use media with purpose, how to make it interactive, thought-provoking, interesting, engaging. I'll give you an example. Like my children have to do everything, right? Because I work in public media and I'm an educator. They got the AP Mama, all that, bless their hearts. So we were watching Great African Civilizations, which was being aired during this. And my husband, who is very well-versed and also an author, it was great because I know as a parent how to co-view with my children. That is heavy content for a 3rd and a 6th grader, right? But I loved that watching my husband interact with them with that media, because he tried to then go into a whole lesson on comparative slavery, which was great. It kind of went over their heads, but you know, our hope is that when parents are watching media with their kids, they're going to start having those organic conversations, not just sitting them in front of the TV, but co-viewing, kill-viewing. And these are, you know, some of our efforts right now, but it's always my vision and that of the children's and education team to reach the entire state of NC equitably with distribution of resources, events, professional development, and programming, because that's equitable practice. You know, it's not a quick fix. So thinking about what actions we can take going forward, there's so many that have been highlighted. And as my fellow panelists have said, the inequities have been there, right? And the one that I've always struggled with the most as a teacher and as an educator, who I will always be a KinderStar teacher, is being proactive as much as possible versus reactive. I think happens a lot with equity work, and I'm going to talk about my own personal journey, is it can be projected as it's a huge task. How do we start? How do we take a bite out of this cow? And so instead of picking up the fork, sometimes we kind of say, okay, it's big, and we're going to keep talking around it instead of having actionable steps. So procrastination cannot apply to equity work. And in order to make the necessary shifts, I've always argued that it starts with the mindset of establishing an equitable lens. and that these are not instantaneous shifts. Cornelius Minor said that there is no such thing as microwave equity, which is a phrase that I really appreciate, which basically means uprooting inequitable actions and mindsets and circumstances is not as easy as popping microwave popcorn, which only tastes so-so and you forget about it anyway, and you can buy it for 99 cents. But instead take the time to get out that oil and the kernels and the pot and do the work from the ground up. And in the process, you're going to learn how to make one that tastes better and lasts longer. So our actions are really determined by our mindset. And my greatest fear as an educator was always the limitations that we put on our children due to our experiences and perceptions of them, and how many geniuses we have stifled with our personal bias, not always malintended, but towards their actions or their circumstances. And we're going to all go through this pandemic, and we're all going to come out on the other side, all connected to the same reason. We've all gone through this because of the virus itself. However, on the other side, all children are going to have had different experiences through this, as we're experiencing right now with access to technology and all of the different insecurities that are amplified right now with food and safety and where am I going to be, all of that. Know that on the other side, that's going to be even more amplified. And we have to be aware and ready for those behaviors that are going to manifest when they come back to school, and be aware that those are going to be cries for communication. That's what they're going to be trying to figure out the whole situation. So when I was thinking about going back forward as a parent and as a teacher and in my work, I was thinking we really have to be aware of those gaps when they come back and be proactive in establishing those relationships and being really authentic about it. I know that being a kindergarten teacher, the kids came in with all different disparities in terms of background knowledge, right, and skills. Well, through this pandemic, they're all going to be coming in with different experiences through digital access. So there's going to be gaps in skills in terms of access and gaps in skills in terms of actually even using it that are going to have to be addressed first before any other learning can happen back in the school space, and being mindful of that. It's about being prepared to see our kids and taking account to their circumstances, but not limiting to them, but starting by creating that safe and loving environment before any learning can take place. And that's for all students. And going back to what Dr. Bridges said, vacation, that is a huge step that I hope we all keep going forward with. That's where it starts. Our parents, and me as a parent, I can say, again, going from back and forth, I need to be communicated with and seen as a valuable partner. And if I'm seen as a valuable partner and that relationship is established, no pandemic or any circumstance is going to keep me away from that relationship with my school district and my teacher, because it's there. And so, making sure that we go through whatever we have to do. You got to call, you got to meet, you got to do whatever, got to go to the door. I appreciate all you guys on the ground doing that work. That is so imperative and so rooting. And that's what's going to promote sustainable change, honestly. When you start with authentic connections that are based in connection and respect and not judgment and not just call and response to behavior, you're going to get it. You're going to get that buy-in, and that's going to start authentic equity work in and of itself.
Mallory?
Yeah,
Mallory?
I know I got to stop.
Yeah, I was going to see, well, first of all, thank you for bringing up the connection with parents, because that is so important always, but especially in this time. But I was going to see if we could stop there, because I want to get James Ford in here. So, and I want to make sure we have some time for questions. So if you could hold.
Sorry, I could go forever. I told you I got too many lenses.
I know, you're all packaged into one. But thank you so much for your comments. But I'm going to shift to James now. And James, you're wearing two hats, that of a state board, North Carolina State Board of Education member, and also executive director for the Center of Racial Equity in Education. So I would like to see how you're thinking and what kind of connections you're making to the crisis now in terms of educational equity.
Absolutely. And once again, I just want to say I appreciate being included in on the conversation. And I am going to kind of toggle between those two hats. And so I begin with the state board by saying that First of all, I want to extend gratitude and appreciation to all the educators, those who are on the front lines, like yourself, John, the teachers, as well as those who are working in the central office and personnel, because none of what we're doing, be it even if it's a response and reactive, could be possible without y'all's leadership and y'all's hard work. From the state board perspective, we view things at a much higher lens, if you will, and I think that it's what's obvious to us as a result of this is that so many of the issues, as has already been stated, are they're pre-existing. And then we have to admit that even on our best day in North Carolina public schools, that there were pre-existing inequities, and that this pandemic has exacerbated those and has magnified those in ways that are really unfortunate, but also educative. And so, in very short order, we've had to respond really to the needs of students, particularly those in the margins, those groups that have been mentioned already. So we're talking about students of color, students who are experiencing poverty, ELs, special education students, and in the various sort of positionings and social locations of our counties, right? So one of the things that we've done in response to that is we've provided guidance with regard to grading for our students, because as has been mentioned, this really throws things into a tizzy. And as a state board, we've really tried to take leadership and helping to provide some understanding of what this looks like, this new educational environment, and how do we assess student learning and maintain those relationships. And so as you all have seen, I'm sure that at this point that we've provided some guidance for what is remote learning. And we've also included as part of the definition of remote learning, 5 what are called critical factors for effective remote learning. And so we're talking about learning that's accessible by all students, for which learning is intended in response to the diverse learning groups, that maintains that consistent communication between instructional staff and students. And so again, going back to this notion of relationship building and maintaining those relationships, access to the curricular and instructional needs associated with the appropriate standards, and then including evidence of student learning, which is a lot more difficult in this environment. But whether it be through packets, whether it be through Canvas assignments, or Google Classroom, or even phone calls, if you will, finding ways to provide evidence for the teacher that student learning is taking place. But then in addition to that, considering the whole child as well as the home learning environment. And these things, these guidance, I had to say with a little bit of pride from the state board perspective, we were already including a focus on equity and a focus on the whole child as a part of our strategic plan that we adopted in 2019 for 2020-2025. All of our objectives, all of our goals center around those 2 things. And so whereas we didn't necessarily have an emergency plan in place, I think that our foci were appropriately adjusted, and I think that we've responded in kind. In addition to that, when you think about the districts that are best suited to respond to some of those needs, and you talk about all the things that both of our superintendents have talked about they've been doing, particularly provision of meals, distribution of hotspots, et cetera. We've released and allocated $50 million of COVID-19 supplemental funds. And, not without some controversy, those funds, the formula created to distribute those funds, included the ADM, or the average daily membership of the district, but then also the low wealth percentage of the district. And so we really tried to concentrate those monies into the hands of LEAs who have the least ability as it currently stands to provide those supplements, right, for child nutrition, for child care, for remote learning, for sanitation, and all the other needs and those gaps that had to be filled in the interim right now as we try to shore up a semblance of education and fulfill our constitutional obligation. And so from the state board perspective, we're still deliberating over these things. We're still deliberating over what to do about grading, still deliberating over how to meet all student needs, and then also taking care of our staff as well, particularly our certified staff, because they have children, many of them. To put on my CREED hat, as you know, CREED is an organization that exists to close racialized opportunity gaps in the P20 education system in North Carolina. And so even with the release of our 2 reports last year, Erasing Inequities, which looked at all the race-based disparities across about 30 different educational indicators throughout the state, we were already starting to call out where some of these disparities live and how they pronounce themselves. And then also providing with a document deep-rooted the history of some of these things, right? Because, there's a backdrop, there's a historical backdrop here. And as much as this is historic, we cannot tear this historical event out of the pages of the context of history. that there's a basis and a context here that needs to be scrutinized. As future-facing work, what we've done is we've invited educators as part of our education professional learning network called Teaching in Color, where we have monthly Twitter chats, and we invite individuals who are teachers of color themselves or support educators of color to dream and envision what a new education system looks like. This is a moment that I think gives us pause, but it also presents us with an opportunity to think about, frankly, for a lot of kids, this system already wasn't working. And now with our attention arrested and some of this learning disrupted and potentially having long-lasting effects, we desperately need to think about new and innovative ways, not only to close those gaps, but to cast a vision for the future. And so asking teachers, instead of crowdsourcing ideas about what that might look like going forward, there is no reason for us to, in my mind, have any sort of attachment or adherence to the status quo or what education used to look like. There were already fissures in that foundation, there were already cracks. And so now more than ever, I think we recognize that there's an opportunity for us to do things differently. And so thinking about what that looks like as part of our mission and creed. We are an organization that embodies the notion of radical imagination. And so that is this notion that we don't want to ignore the present circumstance. We want to acknowledge that wholeheartedly and full-throatedly, but at the same time, what we're asking is not so much what we want to tear down, but what is it we want to build? And so when I talk about the learnings of what we can do going forward, I think one thing we have to recognize is that, to borrow a Kingian reference here, we are trapped in an inescapable web of mutuality. And, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That these issues that we're talking about ultimately are systemic in nature, they're infrastructural. They expose the interdependence of our institutions, because when we talk about students on the margins, we're oftentimes talking about populations who don't have access to stable food sources, who don't have access to housing, who don't have access to adequate health care, et cetera, et cetera. And so, whereas we don't tend to view those issues or those things as educational equity items, ultimately, when something like a pandemic swings through, it exposes those things and it really amplifies those in ways that are just no longer ignorable. And so as we seek and as we envision constructing a truly equitable education system, this gives us an opportunity to think outside the box. A personal bias of mine is, even the discussion of grading. What function and what utility do grades have in this moment? As adults, most of us don't get graded. Usually those who work, we have some sort of performance evaluation that just kind of demonstrates our level of competency. And so maybe we can rethink our adherence to that and kind of an old antiquated model in education and begin to envision something different, whereby blended learning, where we do rely upon some internet access and some technology to do some instruction, but also we accommodate the very personal needs of students and begin to focus more on the mastery of certain concepts. And so, these are the lessons that we're taking from this work and really taking, the opportunity not to be so in despair. And again, I don't want to downplay or diminish the unprecedented nature of what we're facing. But if there ever was an opportunity to sort of pull the emergency brake and say, hey, we don't have to proceed forward in the fashion and the manner that we've gone. We have a real opportunity here to really embody equity and to really think about the differential needs of people as they're stratified throughout our society and find ways to respond to that as a system starting right now and going forward into the future. We're really trying to use that as a frame and going forward, even with our public convenings, with our Freedom Hill Coalition, and some of the other work that we're doing with educators throughout the state. So that's, in summary, the two hats. As I toggle back and forth, the mentality remains the same, and that's how do we equalize opportunity for all of our students in North Carolina?
Thank you so much. I really like your concept of radical imagination. And I think that's one of the things, the purpose of this particular webinar series is we're trying to, have a space, an intellectual and emotional space where educators and others can think about, obviously, the crisis that we're in at this moment and marshal all of our resources and do what we need to do for the moment, but simultaneously think about, what could the future look like? As you said, James, what could the future look like for education. So actually taking advantage of the crisis to reimagine education, because I think a lot of times, you know, we go along, we make our efforts, but when we're thrown into a crisis, everybody's off balance. You do kind of get out of the box because of necessity, and so that is a moment to think futuristically. So I appreciate all of the ideas that you guys have surfaced here, and I think it's really important for our continuing conversation around educational equity. I'm going to ask you guys to unmute, and if you have a question for each other, we'll take maybe one question from you guys to the other panelists, and then I want to move to a couple of questions from our audience. Anybody have a question for one of the panelists? I think I would like to throw one in. We had a comment on our chat line about educational equality versus educational equity. And it might be helpful if someone would like to explain the difference, and so the audience can understand the different perspectives on those two terms. Anybody want to do that for us? Lynn, I think you actually offered one on the chat line. Do you want to take a stab at it?
I'm spending a lot more time thinking about where every child is at and being a lot more learner-centered.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what does that learner really care about, want to do, want to study, passionate about? And if they don't know, how can we help them find that? Because once a student is excited about learning, and it doesn't really matter what it is that they're learning. I use the example, I was a pretty poor reader until we started to go to a one-to-one digital conversion when I was a superintendent in Rock Hill. And the only way I could learn about it was to read constantly. And a couple of years ago, someone said, wow, you can read a book really quickly. And I thought, I've become a reader. And I didn't do it to become a reader. I did it to learn something I was interested in. So when we talk about equity, I'm just thinking about every individual child. What is it they can get excited about learning? If we can tap that, I believe that other things will come along with it.
Okay, great.
May I chime in here and offer? I'm going to steal the words of a mentor of mine and former Charlotte-Mecklenburg School Board Chair, Arthur Griffin. And Arthur always likes to recycle when talking about equity. He says, if you treat unequally positioned people equally, then in the end, what you'll get are unequals. Mm-hmm. So the notion of equity is really a particular kind of equality. It's the equality of opportunity. Mm-hmm. But that requires a recognition that people aren't beginning from the same starting point. That students had differential needs based upon where they're socially located, based upon their racial ethnic group, their, the tax bracket of their parents, their family composition, their proficiency of the language, etc. And so when we take into account those differences, how do we equalize opportunity? Because just treating unequally positioned people equally will, in the end, when we play that forward, just create unequals. And so we're really trying to create the equality of opportunity, but that's like a way more nuanced look at what the wide-ranging, diverse needs of students are, long before they ever come into the education system, if we're being honest. But something that, having a responsibility while we're there to make sure that we do our best to respond to those needs while they're present.
And James, I would add on to that what I worry about is often when we're talking about that, what we do is we talk about remediation, response to intervention, like the things we are doing to students who have those gaps, instead of enhancing the things that they love and they care about and they where their strengths are. So I just wish that all the language around it wasn't so negative when we talk about gaps of students. I have lots of gaps. I use one of them. If you ask me to do an algebraic formula right now, I would struggle, but I manage a $200 million budget because I don't need to know algebra to do that. So how do we help those strengths so that we're not always talking about, let's just remediate and pour more in where they have a gap?
That's a good point, Lynn. And I think it also connects with the topic that James brought up earlier around grading. And we've had several people on the chat line talk about grading and the possibility of, if we did transform our grading system and then also work with teachers to have a variety of ways to grade rather than just the number grade. Anybody want to comment, follow up on that?
Well, can I jump in real quick on the
Yes.
last thing? I'm just about to die. Aaron Swanson popped in on the chat line, but I do want to, Lynn, thank you for sharing about that passion. And when we think about it in the EdgeCombe, we have something we call graduate aims. And one of our graduate aims is around students knowing their passions and living them out. Possessing global awareness and agency. And so I do want to just lift that up, that certainly we do talk about gaps. We talk about some deficits that students have, but we also at the same time, we are trying in EdgeCombe to redesign learning. And I do think throughout this pandemic, yes, it's been scary. It's been an uncharted waters, but what we're doing here is we're looking at how do we redesign, how do we create maybe some hybrid models for students, how do we make sure that we're helping students with self-efficacy? How are they able to serve the community, become more resilient, develop their agency? So even though we recognize, yes, there are some academic things, there are some social issues, right? Some mental health issues, but we also have really strong, powerful students. And it's our job, I think, to help build that up. And so again, thank you all for lifting up, reminding us to that positive lens that we have to keep in front of our face. And thanks to James for the definition, the clarity around equity and equality. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Like for this verse too, but thank you, James. That is exactly it. The visual I have is kids on a sidewalk with different squares in front of them, and everybody take one step forward. Well, you still got the same thing there. And for the positive spin, coming from the early childhood space, I've always preached this, that kids are constantly learning, and kids always have skills. So it's not necessarily that they have a gap in assessing skills. It's a gap in terms of those skills that they need to be successful in this place called school, skills.
Right.
School. And if you can tap into those skills that come from their actual experience and tie those into those skills that they need to be successful in this place called school, then we got something.
Very good. Excellent point. We only have a few minutes left. This went by very quickly. So I wanted to see if you could just each take maybe just a few words. And I have one last question for you, and it would have to be quick. I wanted to ask you, what gives you hope during this time? And just give me a few words, and we'll start maybe with James. What gives you hope during this time?
Oh, I thought I had a little more time. I was like, okay, I'm gonna wait till everybody else feels this one.
And you have to go fast because we've only got 3 minutes.
I'm sorry.
Left.
So on a personal note, listen, I'm a person of faith. I believe. I'm a believer. And so, crisis, particularly to folks who have been through some things, albeit not good, is not new. But I'm inspired also by the possibility of transformation, the ability to transform, break out of a current form, and do something different.
Thank you. Anybody else want to share? What gives you hope?
I'd like to jump in and just say that I was just stunned by how the teachers in my school all united around the idea and transformed the way that they taught their classes, and did it without complaint, did it without fear, just jumped in and tried to make it happen. And how well our county tried to respond to the equity issues involving device access, and how quickly we were able to get devices into the hands of our parents and students. So, and then the final thing would be just the optimism that my students have. It's just, I love contacting them on a regular basis because their optimism about how good the future will be once we get through this is just a refreshing tonic in challenging times.
Thank you so much. So we just have like about 90 seconds left. So I'm going to go ahead and close up. First of all, thank you for your participation. I think we surfaced a lot of issues, and we'll be working to synthesize these and put these into a blog post. Also, I want to take 1 second to extend our thanks to all of the many people who are on the front line in the COVID-19 crisis right now. There's so many people who are actually putting their lives on the line so that our state can keep going, so that our country can get going, so that our world can keep going. We appreciate all of you. And we have another webinar that's scheduled for May 6th. And that one is going to be focusing on doing a deep dive on technology and the remote learning. So we hope you'll be able to join us for that. And I'm going to, let's see, James quoted, I think Martin Luther King. I'm going to quote Nelson Mandela. It's one of my favorite quotes. And I think it's appropriate for our webinar today. He wrote, "There can be no contentment for any of us when there are children, millions of children, who do not receive an education that provides them with dignity and honor and allows them to live their lives to the fullest." So we'll let Nelson Mandela have the last word today. And again, thank you all. I wish you all health and that you all stay safe during this time. And hopefully you'll all join us for our next webinar on May 6th. Thank you so much. Have a great day.